The quiet streets of Springfield, Missouri, had held secrets for longer than most residents could remember. In the spring of 2005, a young girl named Clara Benson, 12 years old and full of curious energy, disappeared from her neighborhood one afternoon while walking home from a friend's house. She had always been careful, polite to everyone, a girl who waved at neighbors and greeted strangers with innocent smiles. When she failed to arrive home that day, her mother, Margaret, felt the first sharp pang of worry that would soon grow into weeks of despair. The initial investigation was thorough, yet frustratingly inconclusive. Local police canvassed the area, interviewed neighbors, and organized search parties. But Clara had vanished without a trace. Witnesses were few, and those who saw something could only recall fleeting glimpses of shadow on a porch, a car parked slightly off the street, a faint voice calling a name. None of these fragments fit together at the time, and the case eventually grew cold. For nearly 15 years, Clara's disappearance lingered in the town's collective memory, a quiet ache that no one could fully explain. Detective Marcus Holden, now retired, remembered those early days vividly. The weight of uncertainty pressed on him as he revisited case files years later, driven by a hope that modern investigative techniques could bring answers where old methods had failed. DNA evidence had been limited in 2005, but samples collected from clothing, shoes, and the local playgrounds had been preserved meticulously. It wasn't until 2023 that forensic technology had advanced enough to allow them to re-examine those fragments with a level of precision that seemed almost miraculous. The breakthrough came in a manner that surprised even the most seasoned investigators. A distant relative of a Springfield resident had uploaded a genealogy DNA profile to a national database. The algorithm, silently comparing strands of genetic information, highlighted a potential match linked to one of the old samples. Suddenly, the list of suspects expanded in a direction no one had anticipated. This was not someone notorious in town, not a person whose behavior had ever raised alarms. They were quiet, ordinary, a background figure, whose life had moved in parallel to the Benson family without leaving significant footprints. As the investigators dug deeper, they found records connecting this person to the neighborhood in 2005. His name was Walter Klein, a man in his late 40s at the time of the disappearance. Walter had lived in the area for several years, working at a local warehouse, fixing homes for neighbors, and quietly participating in small community events. There had been no reported incidents, no altercations, nothing that made him stand out. And yet, DNA evidence suggested he had been near Clara on the day she disappeared. Detective Holden organized interviews who lived near Walter at the time. Memories long buried began to surface. Some recalled a man who sometimes lingered on the street in ways that were polite, cautious, almost protective, though, at the time, they hadn't found it remarkable. Others remembered him offering rides to children to their homes or walking them part of the way. Nothing had ever seemed inappropriate, but with the passage of time, the pieces began to form a picture that was both unsettling and revealing. The key moment came when Holden sat down with an elderly neighbor, Mrs. Callahan, whose memory was sharp despite her age. She recalled a day in spring 2005 when she had seen Clara talking to Walter outside her house. Clara had seemed relaxed, even cheerful, as she gestured while speaking. The neighbor hadn't noticed anything alarming, only that the girl appeared comfortable in his presence. Holden noted the subtlety in the memory, the ease with which Clara had approached Walter, the trust in her steps, and the gentleness of their interaction. In hindsight, Those minor details became critical. Forensic teams confirmed that DNA samples collected from the playground where Clara was last seen matched Walter Klein. The pattern suggested proximity, but not necessarily harm, a fact that complicated the narrative. Investigators could now piece together a timeline. Walter had been in the vicinity of Clara during the critical window, but what happened next remained a mystery. The lack of witnesses made the next hours particularly difficult to reconstruct. Holden and his team combed through every record, every old statement, every report from neighbors and friends, looking for even the smallest discrepancy that might provide clarity. Meanwhile, Margaret Benson lived in a state of cautious hope. Every lead brought both anxiety and relief. She had spent years imagining the worst, fearing the unknown fate of her daughter. Yet now, as evidence pointed to Walter, the truth seemed within reach. The tension in the Benson household, once quiet and pervasive, began to shift toward expectation. Margaret followed the investigation closely, willing herself to believe that the girl she remembered, curious, lively, and loving, would finally have the answers her absence demanded. Holden coordinated with the district attorney's office to determine the best strategy for confronting Walter. The approach needed to balance delicacy with firmness. They weren't sure whether he would admit to anything or maintain silence. Given the years that had passed, memory and conscience could work in unpredictable ways. Every detail, from the genealogy evidence to neighbor testimonies, had to be presented carefully. The team also considered Walter's psychological profile, noting that his behavior had always been calm, socially acceptable, and careful not to provoke suspicion. On the morning of the interview, Holden briefed his team. They entered the room with measured steps, aware that this moment could define the resolution of a case that had lingered for nearly 2 decades. Walter was waiting quietly, hands folded on the table, eyes steady, demeanor composed. He did not display aggression, fear, or hostility, simply a quiet attentiveness that made the conversation feel unexpectedly intimate. Holden felt a mixture of anticipation and unease. Years of questions, months of reinvestigation, and countless hours of review had all led to this encounter. The first questions were deliberate, neutral, designed to establish rapport. Holden asked about Walter's life in 2005, his neighborhood, his interactions with children in the area. He spoke carefully, avoiding accusatory tones. Walter responded with calm clarity, acknowledging his work, his relationships, and the casual interactions he had with neighbors and their families. Nothing in his tone suggested concealment or deception. And yet Holden knew that beneath the surface, the critical truth waited. After an extended conversation about ordinary events, Holden shifted to the more specific questions. He described the day Clara disappeared, mentioning the location, the timing, and the collected evidence. Walter listened quietly, expression unchanged, eyes tracking Holden's carefully chosen words. There was a tension in the room, not dramatic, not overt, but subtle, a psychological gravity that pressed gently against every participant. Then Holden presented the DNA evidence. Walter's reaction was measured. His eyes didn't widen in shock, nor did he recoil. He remained still, silent, as if weighing the years and the truth with deliberate care. Holden sensed that something had shifted. This was the moment when decades of hidden memory would encounter the modern precision of science. The room held a breathless pause. Finally, Walter spoke. His voice was quiet, reflective, almost mournful. He admitted that he had been near the playground that day and had interacted briefly with Clara. His tone conveyed remorse, not for the interaction itself, which had been harmless, but for the weight of past choices and unspoken responsibility. He acknowledged the lingering uncertainty surrounding her disappearance and expressed a willingness to provide all details he could recall. Holden and his team listened intently. Walter's confession, partial as it was, gave a sense of direction for the investigation. It revealed movements, locations, and interactions previously unknown. The confession didn't yet solve every mystery, but it illuminated the path forward. The team left the room with renewed purpose, aware that the pieces were finally aligning in a way that could bring resolution to the Benson family and the Springfield community in the following weeks. Investigators used the confession to retrace events of that spring day in 2005. Witnesses were re-interviewed, locations were revisited, traffic patterns, pedestrian timelines, and neighborhood routines were re-examined. Everything was cross-checked against Walter's account. Each step brought new clarity, tightening the timeline, confirming details, and revealing the subtle dynamics that had allowed Clara's disappearance to remain a mystery for nearly 18 years. Margaret Benson followed the developments closely, clinging to every word with a mixture of apprehension and hope. The story of her daughter's disappearance, once a haze of uncertainty and fear, began to form a clear narrative. The pieces that had been scattered across time finally coalesced into a story that could be understood, one that acknowledged the reality of events without assigning blame beyond what evidence supported. And for the first time in nearly 2 decades, Margaret allowed herself to imagine a resolution, a sense of closure, and the possibility of peace. The investigation was far from over, but for the first time since 2005, clarity emerged. Modern technology, careful interviewing, and the patience to pursue even the smallest lead had revealed a path forward. The story of Clara Benson, a young girl whose curiosity and trust defined her, was finally moving toward a conclusion that the community could witness, understand, and accept. And in that slow unfolding of truth, the first steps toward justice were being taken. Steps that would echo through Springfield, offering both relief and insight into the complex dynamics of human memory, decision-making, and conscience. With Walter Klein's partial confession in hand, Detective Holden and his team began the painstaking work of reconstructing Clara Benson's final hours in 2005. Every detail mattered: small steps, casual interactions, and neighborhood patterns that had seemed inconsequential at the time now became critical threads in the narrative. The team created a timeline, aligning witness accounts, school records, and neighborhood routines to understand how a day so ordinary could have ended in tragedy. Walter's memory was surprisingly precise in some areas, but frustratingly vague in others. He recalled walking along Main Street near the playground, hearing the laughter of children and seeing Clara among them. He described her curiosity, the way she turned to inspect a stray bicycle leaning against a fence, the small gestures she made while speaking to friends. Holden sensed that Walter's careful recounting reflected a mind that had practiced control for nearly 2 decades, an attempt to protect himself while acknowledging some fragment of truth. The team used his recollections to revisit the playground, measuring distances, noting sight lines, and reconstructing how an adult might move through the space without drawing attention. Forensic teams examined areas of grass, dirt, and pavement where samples had been collected years earlier. Even after nearly 20 years, some traces remained. The analysis confirmed what DNA testing had suggested. Walter had been present at specific points along Clara's route, near the swing set, and by a small wooded area at the edge of the park. While this did not yet clarify what had occurred, it confirmed that his presence had been more than casual coincidence. Meanwhile, Holden continued interviews with neighbors, approaching each conversation with renewed strategy. Some witnesses had moved away, while others had changed over time, their memories colored by years and speculation. Holden focused on behavioral cues, the subtle expressions and hesitation that often reveal more than words alone. One neighbor, Mr. Harlan, who had been skeptical of police interest in 2005, recalled seeing Walter standing by a car as children left the playground. He had not thought much of it then, but now he remembered the way Walter's gaze had lingered on Clara, a detail that had gone unnoticed but now carried weight. For the Benson family, the past years had been marked by uncertainty, fear, and an absence that nothing could fill. Margaret, her husband, and Clara's older brother found themselves reliving the trauma each time a new lead emerged. Yet there was a strange combination of anxiety and relief. Finally, there was movement, a sense that the mystery might be untangled. The human mind often struggles with unresolved events, and Holden recognized that the family's emotional state was a critical factor in how the case might unfold. Every meeting, every update was balanced with sensitivity to their trauma. Psychologists consulted on the case provided insight into Clara's behavior as well. At 12, she had been both cautious and confident, traits that could explain her brief interactions with an adult like Walter without immediate alarm. Children at that age often trust what they see as consistent and benign, especially if the adult is familiar or seemingly kind. This understanding allowed investigators to approach the case without victim blaming, focusing instead on the patterns of deception and concealment that had permitted her disappearance to remain unresolved for so long. The breakthrough in unraveling Walter's actions came when the team examined his personal history, uncovering subtle inconsistencies in accounts he had given over the years. Records showed movements that placed him near critical locations around the time Clara vanished. While at first glance they were harmless errands, work-related trips, small neighborhood interactions, when combined with DNA and behavioral evidence, they painted a troubling picture. Patterns of timing, choice of routes, and casual observation of children suggested a calculated familiarity that had gone unnoticed in real time. Holden coordinated with forensic psychologists to analyze Walter's statements during the initial interview. They noted a tendency to minimize, to describe events in ways that seemed socially acceptable while omitting uncomfortable details. This behavior is common in individuals who attempt to reconcile guilt with self-preservation. By reading between the lines, the team inferred locations, movements, and interactions that Walter had not explicitly stated. It was a delicate process. Every assumption had to be corroborated with physical evidence or corroborating testimony to withstand legal scrutiny. A key piece of evidence emerged when investigators re-examined Walter's vehicle records. His car, long since sold, had been photographed by traffic cameras near the playground on the day Clara disappeared. At the time, no one connected these images to the case, but the resolution of modern databases allowed the team to trace the vehicle to Walter. The photos confirmed proximity at specific times, matching both his partial confession and forensic findings. The alignment of DNA, witness statements, and photographic evidence created a compelling narrative that no longer relied on fragmentary recollections alone. The psychological toll on Walter became apparent during follow-up interviews. The weight of years, combined with a confession and the inevitability of exposure, produced subtle cracks in his demeanor. Initially calm and controlled, he began exhibiting signs of internal conflict, hesitation, micro-expressions of anxiety, slight shifts in posture. Holden observed these changes closely, understanding that human behavior under stress can reveal hidden truths. These subtle cues guided investigators as they probed further, asking questions in ways designed to elicit honesty without confrontation. Community members, once passive observers, now became active participants in the reconstruction of events. Social dynamics shifted as memories resurfaced, old rumors were revisited, and conversations sparked new insights. Neighbors who had long dismissed small oddities now recognized them as critical clues. Holden emphasized the importance of collective memory in cold cases, the understanding that humans remember in fragments. And when those fragments are carefully assembled, a clearer picture emerges. One particularly revealing moment came from Clara's school records. Teachers remembered her as diligent, curious, and socially engaged. Several recalled incidents of interaction with adults in the neighborhood, none of which had seemed alarming at the time. These recollections, combined with Walter's confession and modern forensic analysis, allowed investigators to identify the brief windows during which Clara had been vulnerable. It became clear that opportunity, not sheer malice, had been a factor, though the responsibility for exploitation remained solely with Walter. In preparation for potential arrest and prosecution, Holden's team meticulously documented every detail. Reports detailed timelines, evidence chains, DNA findings, photographic verification, and psychological assessments. Each element was cross-referenced to ensure legal soundness. Prosecutors worked closely to construct a case that would withstand challenges, knowing that after nearly 2 decades, memories could be questioned, and defense strategies would focus on the passage of time. Meanwhile, Margaret Benson's life continued in an uneasy balance between anticipation and fear. Every new lead prompted waves of emotion, hope, intertwined with anxiety. The family leaned on one another, reflecting on Clara's personality, imagining how she might have perceived the adults around her, and what small details she might have noticed but never reported. Understanding the psychology of a 12-year-old in that moment became essential for interpreting the events of 2005 accurately, and for preparing for the confrontation with Walter. Holden's team also examined Walter's broader life context, noting social behaviors, employment history, and relationships that had gone unexamined in 2005. Patterns emerged, suggesting that his interactions with the community had been carefully controlled. Maintaining a facade of normalcy, the subtle manipulation of perception, combined with a long period of inactivity in terms of suspicious behavior, explained why neighbors and authorities had not suspected him earlier. It also highlighted the complexity of human psychology in cold cases, how ordinary appearances can conceal extraordinary culpability. As investigators closed in, Walter was called in for a follow-up interview. The atmosphere in the room was thick with anticipation. Holden led the discussion, focusing on gaps in the timeline and requesting specific recollections. Walter's responses revealed an uneasy rhythm, careful, deliberate, sometimes hesitant. Yet beneath the caution, traces of remorse and recognition of accountability surfaced. For the first time, his words carried the weight of potential resolution, and Holden felt the momentum shift unmistakably toward closure. Forensic experts continued to examine physical evidence, verifying every DNA match, fingerprint, and trace sample. Each confirmation added pressure, reinforcing the inevitable. The team also reconstructed the neighborhood environment in 2005, mapping line of sight, pedestrian patterns, and potential opportunities for observation or intervention. This spatial analysis, combined with psychological profiling, provided a comprehensive understanding of how the events could have unfolded. By the end of the second part of the reinvestigation, the picture was much clearer. Clara Benson's movements, interactions, and vulnerabilities were carefully traced. Walter Klein's presence, actions, and psychological patterns were well documented. The combination of confession, DNA evidence, forensic analysis, eyewitness recollections, and psychological insight created a multidimensional understanding of the case. The stage was set for the final steps toward justice, with every detail meticulously recorded to support both the pursuit of truth and the family's long-awaited closure. The days leading up to Walter Klein's arrest were tense but filled with a sense of inevitability. Detective Holden and his team meticulously prepared the case, ensuring every piece of evidence, every witness statement, and every trace of DNA was thoroughly documented. They knew that after 18 years, the prosecution would face intense scrutiny. Memories could be questioned, and the defense would attempt to exploit every detail of elapsed time. Yet the confidence in their meticulous reconstruction of events offered a quiet assurance. Finally was within reach. Walter was brought in for one final interrogation, this time under the full weight of the mounting evidence. The room was silent, the air thick with anticipation. Holden opened with measured questions, deliberately giving Walter opportunities to speak freely, to confront the truth in a controlled environment. At first, Walter's responses were calculated, evasive, as if testing how much he could disclose without consequence. But the detectives pressed, gently yet persistently, drawing attention to inconsistencies between his prior statements and corroborated evidence. Slowly, the carefully maintained facade began to crack. Psychologists, observing the interrogation, noted subtle changes in Walter's demeanor. His posture stiffened and relaxed in alternation. His eyes flicked toward corners of the room as if seeking escape, and micro-expressions betrayed an internal struggle between self-preservation and the inevitability of accountability. These tiny cues were critical. They guided Holden in phrasing questions, in introducing timelines, in revealing evidence incrementally to maximize the psychological impact. The detective understood that human behavior under stress often produces confessions when properly handled a delicate balance of confrontation and patience. Walter's confession unfolded gradually. He admitted being present near the park that afternoon in June 2005, and described observing Clara Benson as she played. Initially, he framed his actions as innocent curiosity, minimizing contact. But as Holden referenced forensic evidence and photographic verification, Walter's narrative shifted. He confessed to approaching her, luring her briefly away from the other children under the pretense of helping with a fallen kite. He detailed moments that matched witness accounts and patterns reconstructed from his vehicle records, aligning his story with established facts in ways that were chillingly precise. The confession revealed more than the act itself, exposed Walter's manipulative methods and psychological calculations. He described how he ensured no one noticed his interactions, how he took advantage of small opportunities, and how he had learned over time to mask behavior to appear unremarkable. It was a window into the mind of someone who had maintained a veneer of normalcy while harboring a capacity for harm. Understanding these details was essential not just for the prosecution, but for the psychological closure of the Benson family. Meanwhile, the Benson family, following the investigation closely, grappled with a storm of emotions. Margaret and her husband experienced a mix of relief, anger, and grief. The truth, though necessary, was painful. They learned not only about Walter's actions, but also about the subtle manipulation that had allowed him to evade suspicion for nearly 2 decades. Clara's older brother expressed anger that such a routine day could have been transformed into tragedy by calculated deceit. Yet, intertwined with these emotions was relief that Walter could no longer escape responsibility, that the family's decades-long quest for justice was approaching its conclusion in parallel. Forensic analysts continued their work, confirming every DNA match, cross-referencing evidence, and validating time. Each confirmation added pressure on Walter, ensuring the confession was not a standalone admission but part of a robust evidentiary framework. Experts meticulously prepared exhibits for the impending trial, visualizing spatial reconstructions, timeline charts, and neighborhood layouts to present a compelling, fact-based narrative. This detailed preparation was crucial. Given the complexities introduced by the passage of time, the arrest itself was executed with precision. Officers approached Walter's residence quietly, minimizing the possibility of panic or resistance. He was taken into custody without incident, and the weight of reality seemed to settle on him immediately. The detectives observed an unusual mix of resignation and subdued anxiety, recognizing that years of evasion had reached an unavoidable endpoint. For the team, it was a victory of methodical investigation, patient psychological insight, and the relentless pursuit of truth. With Walter in custody, the community began to process the resolution. Neighbors who had lived through the years of uncertainty reflected on their own experiences. Many had dismissed subtle warning signs at the time, only to realize in hindsight the layers of observation and manipulation that had gone unnoticed. The investigation highlighted a broader truth about human psychology. Danger often hides behind ordinary appearances, and the passage of time can obscure the signals that might otherwise trigger action. For the Benson family, the trial was both harrowing and necessary. Courtroom proceedings revealed the depth of Walter's deception, the carefully concealed patterns of predatory behavior, and the emotional resilience required to confront the past. Expert witnesses explained the forensic methods, DNA analysis, and psychological profiling that had confirmed the narrative. Holden testified about the painstaking reconstruction of timelines, movement patterns, and witness corroboration, providing a factual backbone that supported the family's understanding of what had occurred. During testimony, Walter's demeanor revealed a complex interplay of guilt, denial, and resignation. He alternated between calm articulation and subtle emotional tremors, a psychological pattern consistent with individuals confronted by evidence that undermines long-standing self-delusions. The courtroom became a stage not only for legal accountability, but also for a deeper confrontation with the human sick. The way deception, rationalization, and careful manipulation can coalesce to hide truth for years, perhaps. The most poignant moments occurred when Margaret Benson spoke. Her words were measured but carried the weight of 2 decades of uncertainty and grief. She detailed Clara's personality, her laughter, her curiosity, and her small acts of kindness. These recollections were interwoven with reflections on how the family had lived in the shadow of absence, constantly imagining possibilities, navigating fear and hope, and seeking closure. The human element of the trial became a bridge between evidence and emotion, emphasizing the profound psychological impact of unresolved trauma. As the trial unfolded, New insights into human behavior and long-term memory emerged. Witnesses recalled fragmented memories, ordinary interactions that had taken on significance only in retrospect, and subtle observations that had gone unreported. Holden noted that human memory, while imperfect, can store critical information for years, even decades, often resurfacing under the right conditions. This understanding reinforced the importance of revisiting old cases with fresh perspectives. Modern technology and psychological insight, the verdict, when delivered, brought a mixture of relief, closure, and lingering reflection. Walter Klein was found guilty, his long-evaded responsibility finally cemented through careful investigation, confession, and compelling evidence. For the Benson family, it was a moment of justice, a recognition that the suffering, uncertainty, and trauma of 18 years were acknowledged, and that the legal system had ultimately fulfilled its role. Yet even in this resolution, the human psyche's resilience and capacity for reflection were evident. As the family began the slow process of emotional recovery and the reassertion of normalcy, in the aftermath, the community reflected on the case's broader lessons. Investigators and psychologists emphasized the importance of vigilance, awareness, and understanding behavioral cues. They highlighted the role of careful record-keeping, forensic innovation, and psychological insight in resolving cold cases. The story of Clara Benson, while tragic, became a catalyst for education, awareness, and the strengthening of procedures to protect children in the future. Detective Holden's team documented the case comprehensively, ensuring that every nuance from the initial disappearance to the confession and trial was preserved. The records served not only legal purposes, but also psychological and educational ones, offering insight into the complexities of human behavior, predation, and the resilience required to pursue justice over decades. The interplay of careful observation, modern forensic methods, and psychological understanding became a model for approaching cold cases, highlighting the multidimensional strategies necessary for resolution. For Margaret and her family, life gradually regained a rhythm. The pain of loss remained, but it was now tempered by clarity, accountability, and the knowledge that justice had been served. They engaged with therapists, community groups, and support networks, channeling grief into awareness and advocacy. The experience underscored the profound impact of unresolved trauma on human psychology and the importance of closure in allowing individuals to reclaim a sense of security and trust. Ultimately, the Missouri 2005 cold case demonstrated the power of persistence, insight, and understanding human behavior in solving long-standing mysteries. It revealed how ordinary appearances can mask extraordinary harm, how patience and observation can uncover hidden truths, and how modern forensic and psychological methods can converge to deliver justice. Clara Benson's story, once shadowed by uncertainty, became a testament to resilience, investigative rigor, and the capacity of human determination to illuminate truth even after nearly 2 decades. As the community moved forward, the lessons of the case remained vivid: vigilance, awareness, empathy, and the understanding of human psychology are essential tools in protecting the vulnerable and ensuring accountability. The case reinforced the idea that time, though it may obscure, does not erase the truth. With careful reconstruction, modern science, and deep insight into human behavior, justice, even delayed, can still be realized. The legacy of Clara Benson's story served as both a cautionary tale and a beacon of hope, showing that persistence, expertise, and courage could ultimately uncover the darkest truths and bring closure to those left behind.